Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be looking at communication in relationships today, especially when one person might be holding back, not really opening up. We got some fascinating material on this topic, and we're excited to get into it.
The thing that really jumped out at me was how much past experiences can really influence someone's willingness to kind of be vulnerable in a relationship. It's like if you've been hurt before, opening up again, it feels risky.
Yeah, like that saying, once bitten, twice shy. And the source material specifically calls out fear of vulnerability and past trauma or abuse as like major roadblocks. I can definitely see how someone might, build walls to protect themselves. But it also makes you realize just how complex this whole issue is. The source even touched on how societal expectations can make it harder to open up, especially for women.
Well, that's a really important point. And while the source does focus on women's experiences, the truth is anyone can struggle with this. I mean, look at men. They're often expected to be stoic, emotionally reserved, and that can make it really hard for them to express any kind of vulnerability.
It's almost like everyone's playing a role, and those roles can sometimes get in the way of, genuine connection. So let's say someone is holding back. What does that look like, practically in a relationship? What are the consequences of not opening up?
Well, imagine this. You're in a relationship, but you don't feel safe enough to truly be yourself, to share your fears, your dreams. That lack of openness, it creates this gap, this distance. It's like a slow leak in a tire, Things might seem okay at first, but eventually it leads to problems.
The source called it unmet emotional needs, which makes total sense. If you're not communicating your needs, how can your partner possibly know what they are, let alone fulfill them? It's like speaking two different languages. But actually, before we jump into solutions, one thing really struck me about how past trauma makes it hard to open up. It got me thinking about attachment theory.
Oh, that's a fascinating connection. Attachment theory essentially says that those early relationships we have, especially with caregivers, they shape how we connect with others as adults. So someone who had inconsistent care as a child, maybe unreliable caregivers, they might have a harder time trusting and opening up in adult relationships.
Wow, that makes so much sense. So you're saying that past experiences can literally wire our brains to approach relationships in a certain way.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to create a safe and supportive environment in our current relationships. But what does safe and supportive really mean? It's more than just saying, I'm here for you. It's about taking action.
So how do we create that kind of space? I mean, the source talks about active listening, but are there other practical things we can do? Sometimes you want to be there for someone, but you just don't know how.
You're absolutely right. And this is where things can get tricky. One common mistake is we jump in with advice, trying to fix the problem, which might seem helpful, but it can make the other person feel like they're not being heard.
Like you're dismissing their experience instead of just being present with them.
Exactly. A truly safe space is one where someone feels accepted and understood without judgment. So instead of jumping into problem-solving mode, focus on validating their emotions. Let them know it's okay to feel however they're feeling.
So just listen and acknowledge, resist that urge to fix it.
Yes. And when you do offer advice or suggestions, try framing them as possibilities, not directives. For example, instead of saying, you should talk to a therapist, maybe say something like, I've heard therapy can be really helpful for some people going through similar things. Have you ever considered that?
That's a much gentler approach. It gives them the space to make their own choices. And speaking of choices, the source also talks about the importance of clear communication about boundaries.
Absolutely. Setting boundaries is all about knowing your limits and communicating them effectively. It's not about controlling your partner. It's about respecting each other's needs and creating a dynamic where you both feel safe.
So how do boundaries fit into this idea of creating a safe space?
Well, when both partners feel comfortable expressing their needs and their boundaries, it builds this foundation of mutual respect and understanding. It reduces the risk of resentment building up over time, and it helps you address conflict, constructively.
It's like you're setting the ground rules for a fair and respectful game. One thing that keeps coming up is this idea of active listening. The source even has quotes from experts like Dr. Sue Johnson and Dr. Esther Perel emphasizing just how powerful it is. But it's one of those things that's easier said than done. What are some concrete ways to actually practice active listening?
Yeah, it's more than just nodding and saying, uh-huh. It takes real effort. You have to pay attention. One helpful technique is reflecting back what you hear. So instead of just passively listening, try summarizing what your partner said. Make sure you understand their point of view. You can say something as simple as, so what you're saying is, and then paraphrase their thoughts and feelings.
Oh, that makes so much sense. It not only shows them you're listening, but it also helps clear up any misunderstandings, right? It's like building a bridge of understanding between two different perspectives.
Exactly. And another key element of active listening is paying attention to nonverbal cues. Body language can speak volumes, so make sure yours is aligned with your words. Put down your phone, make eye contact, lean in a little. Those small gestures make a huge difference.
It's about sending the message that your partner has your full attention, that you're present in that moment. And I think that's a perfect segue to our next point, which is all about, really fostering that deeper connection.
I'm intrigued. Let's dive in.
So we've talked about creating a safe space and really listening, but how do we actually go deeper? How do we move from just hearing each other to really understanding, on a deeper level?
That's where things get really interesting. One technique I find super powerful is what I call emotional mirroring. It's not just reflecting back the words, but the emotions you're picking up from your partner.
Emotional mirroring. I've never heard of that before. What does that look like, practically speaking?
Okay, so let's say your partner's talking about a stressful day at work. Instead of just saying, that sounds rough, you might say something like, I'm hearing a lot of frustration in your voice, and maybe even some sadness. Am I picking up on that right?
Wow, that's so much more validating. You're not just acknowledging the situation, but you're actually acknowledging how they feel about it.
Exactly. It shows them you're not just listening to their words, but that you're tuned into their emotional state. And that can be incredibly powerful for building connection.
It's like you're saying, I see you, I feel you, I get you. And that can be way more meaningful than any advice you could give.
Absolutely. And here's another tip for going deeper. Ask open-ended questions, the kind that encourages your partner to explore their thoughts and feelings more. So instead of asking, did you have a good day? Try something like, what was the most challenging part of your day? Or, what are you feeling grateful for today?
Oh, those are great examples. It's like you're inviting them to share their inner world, not just the surface stuff.
Precisely. And, sometimes the most powerful questions are the simplest ones. Like, tell me more about that, or how did that make you feel? It can really open up a whole new level of conversation.
It's like giving them permission to go deeper, to share things maybe they didn't even realize they needed to talk about. One thing the source mentioned that really stuck with me was the importance of vulnerability. It said that to really connect deeply, we have to be willing to be vulnerable ourselves.
So true. Vulnerability is like the secret ingredient in the recipe for intimacy. When we show up authentically, flaws and all, it gives our partner permission to do the same.
But being vulnerable is scary. What if we get rejected or judged? It feels like putting your heart on the line.
I hear you. It definitely takes courage. But the thing is, true connection, it can only happen when we're willing to risk getting hurt. There's that quote by Brené Brown, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity.
Wow, that's powerful. So how do we actually practice vulnerability in our relationships? What are some concrete steps we can take?
One simple but effective way is to just share your own feelings and experiences. Talk about your fears, your insecurities, the things you struggle with. It doesn't have to be anything dramatic. Just something that shows your partner you're not afraid to be real with them.
That makes sense. It's like you're modeling vulnerability, creating a space where it's safe for them to do the same.
Exactly. And another way to cultivate vulnerability is to practice asking for what you need. We often try to be strong and independent, but the truth is, we all need support sometimes.
Like, instead of saying, I'm fine, when you're clearly not, maybe say, I'm having a rough day. Could I get a hug?
Exactly. It's about allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to ask for help. And that can actually strengthen your relationship because it shows your partner that you trust them enough to let them see your needs.
So it's about creating a dynamic where both partners feel safe enough to be their authentic selves, to share their joys and their sorrows, their strengths and their weaknesses. And that's where the real magic happens, right?
Absolutely. When we can be truly seen and accepted for who we are, flaws and all, that's when we experience that deep level of connection and intimacy.
With all this talk about vulnerability and deep connection, it makes me wonder, are there things we should avoid doing? If we want to foster this kind of communication, what are some common pitfalls that could sabotage our efforts?
That's a great question. And there are definitely some communication traps we can fall into. One of the biggest ones is what I call conversational hijacking. It's when we interrupt our partner or steer the conversation back to ourselves instead of really listening to what they're trying to say.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that sometimes. I get excited to share my own thoughts, and I forget to give my partner the space to fully express theirs.
It's a common mistake,
Yeah.
but it can make our partner feel like they're not being heard or respected. Another pitfall is using accusatory language, those you statements, like saying you always do this or you never listen to me.
Yeah, that definitely puts people on the defensive. It's
Yeah.
like you're attacking them, not addressing the issue.
Exactly. So instead of focusing on blame, try using I statements to express your feelings and needs, like, I feel hurt when I don't feel heard, or I need some space to process my emotions right now.
That's much more constructive. It takes the focus off of blame and puts it on understanding and problem solving.
Right. And another important tip is to avoid giving unsolicited advice or trying to fix our partner's problems. Sometimes people just need to vent, to process their emotions without being offered solutions.
It's like you said earlier, sometimes the best thing we can do is just listen and validate.
Exactly. And remember, even with the best intentions, our attempts to fix things can sometimes come across as dismissive or controlling.
So it's about recognizing that our partner is capable of solving their own problems, and that sometimes the best support we can offer is just being present and empathetic.
Beautifully said. And this brings us to another important aspect of healthy communication, learning how to navigate conflict constructively.
Conflict. It's something most of us try to avoid, but it's inevitable in any relationship, right?
Absolutely. Conflict is a natural part of any close relationship.
Huh.
It's not about whether or not you disagree, it's about how you disagree.
So how do we turn those disagreements into opportunities for growth? For a deeper connection?
That's where the art of communication really comes in. One key principle is to approach conflict with curiosity, not judgment. Instead of assuming you know what your partner's thinking or feeling, ask open-ended questions to really understand their perspective.
So help me understand why you feel this way, or what's making you react so strongly to this.
Exactly. It's about shifting from a defensive posture to a more collaborative one. Another important tip is to focus on the issue, not on attacking your partner's character.
So instead of saying, you're so inconsiderate, you might say, I felt hurt when you didn't call me back.
Perfect example. You're addressing the behavior without making it personal. And remember, it's okay to take a break if things get too heated.
That's so important. Sometimes we need a little time to cool off, process our emotions before we can have a productive conversation.
Absolutely. And when you do come back together, make sure you're listening to each other's perspectives with empathy and respect.
It's about finding that balance between asserting your own needs and validating your partner's.
You got it. And remember, conflict doesn't have to be a negative experience. When approached constructively, it can actually be an opportunity to learn and grow together.
This has been so insightful. I feel like I'm learning so much about how to, create a more open and connected dynamic in my own relationships.
Me too. It's a good reminder that communication is a skill and that we can continue to develop and refine it throughout our lives.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's one key takeaway you'd like to leave our listener with?
I would say the foundation of any truly fulfilling relationship is built on open, honest, and empathetic communication. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to show up authentically, to listen deeply, to navigate conflict constructively.
That's beautifully put. And it reminds us that while the journey of communication can be challenging at times, the rewards are immense.
Absolutely. When we invest in our communication skills, we're investing in the health and happiness of our relationships.
Speaking of investing in our relationships, one thing the source material touched on that I thought was really interesting was this idea of love languages. Have you ever heard of those?
Oh, absolutely. Love languages are a fascinating concept. They basically describe the different ways people give and receive love.
So it's like we all have our own unique dialect when it comes to expressing affection.
Exactly. And if we're not speaking each other's love language, our efforts to show love, well, they might not be received in the way we intended.
That's so insightful. I can see how that could lead to misunderstandings, even conflict. So what are these love languages, and how can we learn to, speak them fluently?
There are 5 main love languages: words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, gifts, and physical touch.
Okay, those all make sense. But how do we know which ones are most important to us and to our partner?
There are quizzes and assessments you can take online. But honestly, the best way to learn your partner's love language is to pay attention. How do they express love to you? What makes them feel most loved?
So it's about observation and communication, just like everything else we've been talking about.
Exactly. And once you know each other's love languages, you can make a conscious effort to express love in ways that resonate with your partner.
That's such a powerful tool. It's like learning to speak the language of love that your partner understands and appreciates.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
And remember, just like any language, it takes practice and patience, but the rewards are definitely worth the effort.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new toolbox for building healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
Me too. It's been a joy to explore these concepts with you.
So as we wrap up this segment of our deep dive, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listener with?
I would encourage our listeners to just reflect on the dynamics in their own closest relationships. Think about the patterns you've noticed, the positive ones, the challenging ones. Where could you apply these insights? What small step could you take today to foster better communication, deepen your connection?
That's such a powerful question. And it reminds us that the journey of understanding and connection, it's ongoing. It's not about reaching some finish line. It's about constantly striving to be better communicators, more present partners.
Beautifully said. And remember, even small changes, they can make a big difference over time.
So true. It's all about taking those small steps, one conversation at a time. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
Wow, this deep dive has been incredible. We've covered so much, from understanding why someone might hold back to actually building deeper connection.
It really has been a journey. And it's a good reminder that communication, it's an ongoing process, right? It's not something you just master overnight. It takes effort, it takes patience, and a willingness to keep learning and growing together.
It's like we're constantly fine-tuning our instruments, to create a more harmonious melody in our relationships.
I love that analogy. And just like with a musical instrument, the more we practice, the more skilled we become at creating beautiful music together.
So true. One thing that's really stood out to me is the importance of self-awareness. It's like we can't really understand our partner's needs, their communication style, if we don't first understand our own.
Absolutely. Self-awareness is the foundation. It's about knowing our own triggers, our communication patterns, and how maybe our past experiences are shaping our interactions today.
It's like looking in the mirror before we can see anyone else clearly.
Yeah.
We need to understand our own reflection first.
Exactly. And that self-reflection, it can be tough, but it's so worth it because it allows us to show up in our relationships with more authenticity, more empathy.
And speaking of authenticity, the source mentions something called emotional bids. Have you ever heard of those?
Oh yeah, emotional bids, they're fascinating. They're basically those little moments throughout the day when we reach out to our partner for connection. It could be a smile, a touch, a question, or even just a look like, I see you, I want to connect.
So we're kind of sending out these signals, hoping our partner will pick them up and respond.
Precisely. And how our partner responds to those bids, it can have a huge impact on the relationship.
So if our partner consistently misses our bids or responds negatively, that can lead to feeling disconnected, maybe even resentful.
Exactly. But when our partner responds positively, it strengthens that bond, creates a feeling of safety and security.
Okay, that makes so much sense. How can we be more aware of those bids, both our own and our partners?
Well, it starts with paying attention. Just notice those little moments when you reach out and how your partner responds, and encourage your partner to do the same. You can even make it a game. See how many bids you can catch each other making.
I love that. It's like a playful treasure hunt for connection.
Exactly. And the more we practice, the more attuned we become to those subtle signals. And the more we respond positively, the stronger that bond becomes.
It's like we're building a bridge of connection, one emotional bid at a time.
Beautifully put. And remember, even when we stumble or miss a bid, we can always repair that connection. A simple apology, a hug, a heartfelt conversation can go a long way.
That's reassuring. It's like we have the power to mend those little tears in the fabric of our relationship.
Absolutely. And that's the power of communication. It's the lifeblood of any healthy relationship. It's the key to understanding each other, to navigating challenges, and to creating a love that truly lasts.
This has been such an incredible journey. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights with us.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the journey of communication, it never really ends. It's an ongoing adventure that we embark on together, one conversation at a time.
So true. And with each conversation, we have a chance to deepen our connection, strengthen our bond, and create a love that's really extraordinary. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone, and keep those conversations flowing.